Tonight's event. I'm Kurt Asher, I'm Dean of the Library. We're going to have this evening Scott B. Bomar and the Bakersfield Sound, and we're very excited about that. I'm indebted to our campus public affairs director, Jennifer Self, whose hard work helped bring this event together for us. She's right there. So. By coincidence, this is almost exactly 10 years after the Public History Institute, whose director is here too, by the way, Miriam Vivian, brought Merle Haggard to campus, and Bob Price interviewed him on stage. So it's kind of a anniversary for that. Bob will be interviewing Scott on stage tonight, and he himself is an aficionado of our local style of country music and the author of The Bakersfield Sound, How a Generation of Displaced Okies Revolutionized American Music. So tonight's guest is Scott B. Bomar. He grew up in the music business in Nashville, earned his graduate degree at Vanderbilt, and then he moved to LA, he worked several years as a songwriter at Sony, and then he moved to the other side of the desk to work at Universal Music Group. In 2013, he joined the staff of BMG, where he's currently the senior director of the company's music-related book publishing department. As a researcher, writer, and lifelong student of music history, Scott has worked on an array of projects with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Grammy Museum, Gibson Guitars, the Americana Music Association, Omnivore Recordings, and Bear Valley Records. His greatest area of passion, though, is the Bakersfield Sound. He served as a consultant for the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum's 2012-2014 exhibit, Bakersfield Sound, Buck Owens, Merle Haggard, and California Country. He moderated several of the museum's panel discussions, including the Buckaroos, Making Music with Buck Owens, California Angels, the Women of the West Country, and Together Again, Pioneers of the Bakersfield Sound. By the way, we do have a Buckaroo here tonight too, so he's sitting in there in the middle, so right there. Additionally, Scott contributed the essay Dim Light, Stick Smoke, and Loud, Loud Music, the story of the Bakersfield Sound, of the museum's companion book. Scott's book, Southbound, A Comprehensive History of Southern Rock, was awarded the best historical research in recorded rock and popular music by the Association for Recorded Sound Collections in 2015. He's also co-authored several books. His latest project is here tonight. You've seen it back there. It's the 10 CD box with the accompanying 225-page book called The Bakersfield Sound, Country Music Capital of the World, Country Music Capital of the West, 1940 to 1974. So without further ado, welcome, Scott.
You're a lot taller than me. I'm gonna have to restructure the whole thing. So, as Kurt said, I grew up in Nashville and grew up around the music industry. Obviously, the country music industry is the predominant music industry in Nashville. I moved to Los Angeles in 2000, so almost 20 years ago now. And I knew who Buck Owens and Merle Haggard were. I mean, I more than knew who they were. I was a fan. And there were other West Coast artists that I was aware of. But I learned that there was a much greater depth to the history of country music in California in general, and specifically in Bakersfield, than I was aware of having grown up in Nashville. My interest in the Bakersfield Sound started out just by being a fan. And starting to collect records, buying records on eBay, buying records from collectors, anything Bakersfield related. Didn't matter if it was good or not. If it was Bakersfield related, I'd buy it. And amassed this huge collection of 45 RPM singles, a few LPs, and just kind of kept going down the rabbit hole and going down the rabbit hole. And I am a writer, and at some point I decided I'm going to write a book about the history of the Bakersfield Sound. And then Bob Price did it first. So he beat me to the punch. And I'm still going to one of these days, but I thought, what's something else that I can contribute that is unique, that is a good companion to the great work that Bob has already done? And so pulling together a lot of this music that I had collected became really important to me because a lot of it had never been digitized before. A lot of these old 45s, some of them maybe only 100 or 200 copies were pressed up at the time, and a lot of them had just kind of faded into obscurity. And I thought, a project like this is worth it, if only for the reason that some researcher 200 years from now wants to find out what this whole Bakersfield Sound thing was all about. There will be a place to go and hear the music in the best quality that they can hear it. It's preserved digitally forever, and the accompanying 225-page book has information about all the artists that are on it. Some are very well known, like Buck and Merle, and others are pretty obscure. And I would say no matter how deep your love for the Bakersfield Sound is, there will be at least one or two artists on this box set that you go, okay, I haven't run into that one before, because we really tried to show how deep and wide the music community was here in Bakersfield during this era. So tonight, we're going to structure it this way. I'm going to do a short lecture. We are at a university after all, so it feels appropriate to have a lecture. And then after that, Bob and I are going to come up and talk, and then we're going to have audience questions, comments, throwing tomatoes, whatever. So that'll be an opportunity at the end of the night to kind of widen the conversation amongst all of us. So kind of a three-part evening. And because we are on a college campus, I know that there are probably people here who maybe are vaguely aware of the names Buck Owens and Merle Haggard. Like, isn't there streets named after those guys? And there's other people here who lived the Bakersfield Sound era, who were friends with all of these folks. So I think we have a pretty wide range of knowledge in the room tonight, from people who are just coming to it to people who are truly a part of it. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about tonight, I wanted to talk about something that would hopefully be of interest to everyone, whether you are a true devotee or whether you're just checking this out for the first time. I wanted to talk about something that everyone could find engaging. And I like to tell stories. And so I'm going to tell a story as this lecture of one character and one part of why there is something that we call the Bakersfield Sound today. And it's not a typical story, and it's not a typical character that you hear about. And that's why I wanted to go that direction. We could pluck 50 different characters out of this book and box set and focus on them and spend 3 months here talking about all the folks who contributed to the Bakersfield Sound. But with that preface, let me just jump into it. The first thing I want to say is that the idea of the Bakersfield Sound continues to loom large. And I do have, obviously, some slides over here just to keep it fun and visual. We heard about it in the recent multi-part Ken Burns documentary called Country Music. And a few short years back, the Country Music Hall of Fame and Museum in Nashville launched a featured exhibition called The Bakersfield Sound, Buck Owens, Merle Haggard, and California Country that ran for 3 years. And then last year, singer Dwight Yoakam launched a new satellite radio station on Sirius XM called Dwight Yoakam and the Bakersfield Beat. I'm sure some of you were at his show Friday at the Fox Theater, and he's going to be doing an entire Bakersfield-themed residency coming up in Las Vegas. But what is the Bakersfield Sound? That's the $20 million question. And as most of you probably know, the indisputable twin pillars of this city's musical legacy are, of course, Buck Owens and Merle Haggard. But do Buck and Merle actually have a uniform sound that is unmistakably, quote-unquote, Bakersfield? Because if you compare Buck's Love's Gonna Live Here with Merle's Silver Wings, for example, you're not going to find many musical commonalities. So which one of those is the Bakersfield Sound? Well, most people think of twanging Telecaster guitars, they think of crying steel guitars, and while many musicians in Bakersfield certainly relied on those elements, they weren't always ubiquitous. There has always been variety in the sounds that have come from this town. And the point here is that the Bakersfield Sound is not so much a sound, meaning that it's not necessarily a musical formula per se, but I think the reason we have that term, Bakersfield Sound, is because it's a shorthand way of saying that something musically and culturally significant took root and flowered in and around Bakersfield during a specific era that made a phenomenal impact on commercial country music. So in other words, the Bakersfield Sound, as I understand it, actually refers to a time and a place that gave birth to two of country music's biggest stars, rather than referring to a strict musical definition. And specifically, that era really began picking up steam in the 1950s and hit its commercial height in the early 1970s. Now, the man who is universally considered the father of the Bakersfield Sound is band leader and multi-instrumentalist Bill Woods. And Bill led the house band at the Blackboard, which was Bakersfield's quintessential honky-tonk and the place where Buck Owens spent the better part of a decade playing in Bill's band and learning his trade. And at one time or another, Woods employed virtually everyone who contributed to the thriving country music community in Bakersfield. And I would say that Bill Woods was the heart and soul of the local Bakersfield music scene and deserves every bit of credit that he is afforded for what he did. But Bill Woods, I think, is largely remembered because he was widely beloved. People loved Bill Woods. But there's another figure who is virtually unknown to anyone other than obscure rockabilly record collectors, who just might be the commercial link that explains why we're still talking about the Bakersfield Sound today. It's not a name you hear very often. Hillbilly Barton. Hillbilly Barton arrived in Bakersfield in 1952, and within a year he would open the first Bakersfield-based country label. He would write the first #1 single featuring predominantly Bakersfield musicians, and he would indirectly, very indirectly, but indirectly lay the groundwork for Tally Records, which was the launching pad for Merle Haggard and the only independent Bakersfield record label to ever score national chart success. So why does Billy Barton not get any credit? Why is he not remembered? Well, for starters, he was brash, and he had a big mouth, and he was a shameless self-promoter, and he hung around the Bakersfield clubs bragging and swaggering and peddling his songs, and he talked too much, and he drank too much, and he was too ornery, and he spent most of his energy trying to sleep with other musicians' wives. So as I said, Bill Woods is remembered largely because he was beloved, and Billy Barton is forgotten largely because he was reviled. So Bill Woods was certainly the center and the heart and soul of the musical community in Bakersfield. But Hillbilly Barton was the unwitting catalyst in a series of events that I argue were key moments in establishing the Bakersfield Sound as a commercially successful movement. And that's the story I want to tell you tonight before we jump into some specific questions about Bakersfield's music history. So this is a tale of double dealing, of shady music business shenanigans, and a charlatan who ultimately fell victim to his own ego. And the story goes like this. Hillbilly Barton was born John R. Grimes on November 21st, 1929 in the town of London, Kentucky, just over 40 miles north of the Tennessee border. And unlike many of his contemporaries who headed to California in search of work either in the oil fields or in fruit orchards, Barton headed for the West Coast to seek his fortune as a country singer. Arriving in Hollywood in 1950, he hit the street, walking from music publishing houses and record labels, banging on doors with a notebook of original songs in one hand and a guitar in the other. And after slogging it out for over a year with little success, he hooked up with a guy named Faber Robison. And Robison was a record producer, a manager, a promoter, and a hustler who was one of the great characters of the burgeoning post-war hillbilly record business in Los Angeles. And Robison had been working with American Music Publishing Company as a talent and song scout, and he'd recently launched a label called Abbott Records. So Faber signed Billy Barton and secured him an exclusive songwriting deal with American Music that paid him $100 per week, which was significant money for a songwriter in the early 1950s. And that songwriting, by the way, that songwriting deal that he signed is going to become an important detail as this story unfolds. So in February of 1952, Barton cut his first single, Strange Affection. I interviewed Barton several years ago. He has since died, but he said, "That thing took off like crazy. In Bakersfield, that was the hottest record to ever come along up there. They wanted me to come, so I went up there and I got hot in no time. Played the blackboard and packed them out." So while Barton was undoubtedly a big talker who was prone to exaggeration, the number of ads in the local paper for his return engagements at the blackboard suggests that he was, in fact, quite popular. Whether or not it was actually, quote, the hottest record to ever come along, as he claimed, is questionable, but perfectly in line with his typical braggadocious style. And you'll notice in this ad that he's billed as California's loudest hillbilly singer. I don't know if that's a compliment. I don't know. So ultimately, Hillbilly Barton moved to Bakersfield from the Los Angeles area, and in late 1952, he established the first Bakersfield-based country music label, which was called Marvell Records. And the debut release was number 100, A Debt I Must Pay, which was recorded by the beloved Bill Woods and his Orange Blossom Playboys with Louis Talley on lead vocals. Now, around the same time, Barton opened a second label called Grande Records, which he launched with a release by Cousin Ebb Pilling and his Ozark Squirrel Shooters. He also pressed up copies of his, and this is an important thing to know about Billy Barton, he pressed up copies of his Abbott recordings on his own label. Now remember, Barton was still under contract to Abbott Recordings and to American Music, so he was essentially ripping off the companies that were paying him in advance by bootlegging his own records and then selling them out of the trunk of his car. So now that you have a sense of who Billy Barton was, let's drill down into the drama surrounding one song of his that had the significant ripple effects that I alluded to earlier, and is the single song that just might be the reason we're talking about something called the Bakersfield Sound to this day. And that song is a Dear John letter, which was a massive hit duet for Gene Shepard and Ferlin Husky in 1953. It reached number 1 on the country chart. It was a top 5 pop single. It was produced by Ken Nelson on Capitol Records, and it was also the first number 1 country single to feature predominantly Bakersfield musicians, which is an important point. But before it was a national hit, it was a local Bakersfield hit in a couple of versions that ignited controversy. The first was recorded by Bill Woods and Rita Goodwin on the obscure Chord label, and the writer credit simply read, Hillbilly Barton. Next, it was cut by Fuzzy Owen and Bonnie Owens with an S, and that's Bonnie on the far right sitting next to Fuzzy. For those of you who are not already aware of the dynamics here, Bonnie was not related to Fuzzy Owen, though they were dating at the time. Her last name, Owens, came from Buck Owens, who was her husband before she was dating Fuzzy Owen, and then she later married Merle Haggard. All in the family. So Barton was at Bakersfield's Clover Club one night where Louis Talley's band was performing, and Talley was the singer on that first Marvell release that I mentioned a moment ago, and that's him on the left there in the photo. And his cousin, Fuzzy Owen, in the middle, played steel guitar in the band, and Bonnie was a cocktail waitress who got up and sang regularly. And when Barton heard the two sing a duet in the club, he thought they would be perfect to record another version of a Dear John letter. So the Fuzzy and Bonnie version was released on Barton's Marvell label, and the writer credit was simply listed as H.B. Barton, which of course stands for Hillbilly Barton. At some point in early 1953, Louis Talley approaches Billy Barton and offers to trade him a car, a 1947 Kaiser, in exchange for the ownership of a Dear John letter. So Barton agrees, sells him the song, and then Barton proceeds to drive all over town telling everyone what a sucker Louis Talley is for trading away a car for a worthless song. Now, before long, Barton has loaded up his new Kaiser with the various records that he's promoting, both legitimate and bootlegged, and he sets out across the country playing gigs and selling his records to anyone who's willing to plunk down the money. Meanwhile, Louis Talley sells half his ownership of a Dear John letter to his cousin and bandmate Fuzzy Owen for $150. They soon find an outlet for their newly purchased asset thanks to Ferlin Husky. Now, before he was a national country star and country music hall of famer, Ferlin Husky was a West Coast singer who moved to Bakersfield at the urging of, you guessed it, Bill Woods. Bill secured Ferlin a job as a radio DJ at local station KBIS soon after Ferlin had started recording for Capitol Records. And Ferlin was the first Bakersfield guy to record at Capitol Records, which became a channel for a lot of these other guys. He's not often given credit for that, which I think is an important connection. So Ferlin Husky was an important link in the chain of what becomes the Bakersfield Sound. So Ken Nelson had signed Ferlin Husky as an artist, and in an interview with Ferlin several years ago before he died, which is the best time to interview people, he told me, Ken Nelson said, "We just signed up a girl named Jean Shepherd. She lives up near Bakersfield, and I'd like for you to help pick songs for her." Well, Bonnie Owens and Fuzzy had a record out on a Dear John letter that they'd put out on Marvell. I'd play it on KBIS, and they got requests. At first, I was thinking, well, this is just the fans at the Lucky Spot or wherever they were working, you know. But I played it a couple of weeks, and hell, there was something to it. And then I took it down to Ken Nelson. I said, this would be a good one for Gene. And he heard those lines about my love for you has died away like grass upon the lawn, and he just laughed. I said, hell, I laughed too when I first heard it, but this thing is a hit. So Jean Shepherd's record of a Dear John letter, featuring Ferlin Husky on the recitation, was released in the summer of 1953. The writer credits on the label make no mention of Billy Barton. Instead, the song was credited to Lewis Talley and Fuzzy Owen. They had, after all, made a deal. So, Gene and Ferlin's version of a Dear John letter entered the Billboard Country Singles Chart on July 25th. It rocketed to the #1 position by the following month. It stayed there for 6 weeks. It sold over 1 million records and crossed over to the #4 spot on the pop charts. Meanwhile, Billy Barton is out on the road selling his inventory of the Bonnie and Fuzzy version of a Dear John letter. In his words, I sold thousands of those damn records out of that car. I went to jukebox operators, record stores, everything there was. Finally, I got to Lexington, Kentucky. I walked into this record store, and there was a woman who worked in there named Ann Hundley, and I said, I got a record I want you to hear. I put it on the turntable, and she said, oh, Lord, I've heard that thing 5 times today. And this is how Billy Barton finds out that his song, well, technically a song that was formerly his, has become a national hit, and he's furious. He hightails it back to California to confront Lewis Talley and Fuzzy Owen, whom he suspects have played him. He's making wild accusations, he's threatening to sue, and Barton's interpretation was this, in his own words. That was sort of a dirty deal. See, I'd done pitched the song to Ferlin, and he didn't record it, but when Fuzzy got it, Ferlin cut it right away. But remember that Faber Robison had previously secured a publishing deal for Hillbilly Barton with American Music that paid Barton $100 a week in advance. And that's the kind of advance a publisher is going to be eager to earn back. But Talley and Owen are now the owners of the song that Barton never had the authority to sell, and they've already signed it with another publisher. So how did this happen? The likely scenario is that Ferlin Husky saw that the song was getting great feedback from listeners on his radio show. Fuzzy and Louie knew it was getting great response on their friend station back in Arkansas. They all believed that the song could be a hit, and since Husky was the only guy in town with a record deal on Capitol, they knew that he was much more connected to the mainstream music industry than Billy Barton was, so they decided to hitch their wagon to Ferlin. Now, Bill Woods, the man who recorded the original version of the song and played piano on both Barton's Marvell release and on the Capitol release, gathered all the parties to try to come up with a solution to resolve the drama. They came over to my house, Woods told author Gerald Haslam. They was crossways with each other over it, but they finally got things straightened out. In the end, the publishing reverted back to American Music, and the writer credits were changed to Billy Barton, Lewis Talley, and Fuzzy Owen on the sheet music and on the future pressings of the record. But as Fuzzy Owen once told me with a wink, Billy Barton was a con man who got conned. So why do I suggest that this episode had ripple effects that made an impact on the commercial phenomenon that has come to be known as the Bakersfield Sound? 3 important reasons. 1, the musicians on Jean Shepherd's session were predominantly Bakersfield pickers: Bill Woods, Lewis Talley, Fuzzy Owen, Tommy Collins, and Ferlin Husky. Now, once he started having hits with these guys, Capitol Records' Ken Nelson, of course, began using them more frequently. And in fact, according to Fuzzy, it was Nelson who first coined the term Bakersfield Sound to refer to the crew of musicians that Ferlin introduced first for his own Capitol sessions and then for that session with Gene. Now, if these guys weren't making hits, they wouldn't have been around for long. But once a Dear John letter hit, Ken Nelson wanted those players to come back down and duplicate the success that he had had. So this is a really important first step to ensure Bakersfield's ongoing presence at Capitol Records in Hollywood for the next 2 decades. Secondly, thanks to the success of A Dear John letter, Gene Shepard and Ferlin Husky hit the road. So that meant that Ferlin was no longer available to play on Capitol sessions as frequently as he had been doing up to that point. Now, this was bad news for Tommy Collins, since Ferlin was the band leader and lead guitarist on Tommy's first Capitol session, which produced the hit You Gotta Have a License. So Ferlin needed to find someone else who could play guitar in his place, and he recruited Buck Owens. Recording with Tommy Collins was Buck's introduction to Capitol Records, and after 3.5 years of playing on sessions for Ken Nelson, he finally convinced the producer to give him his own artist deal on Capitol. But had Ferlin never left to go promote that record, he probably would have just kept playing lead guitar on Tommy Collins records, and we might not have heard of Buck Owens. Third, Louis Talley and Fuzzy Owen went from local musicians to nationally successful music industry figures thanks to A Dear John letter. They made some real money. They ultimately invested in their own label, Talley Records. And even though Billy Barton was the first one to open up a country label in Bakersfield, proving that it was possible, Talley and Owen were the most successful at it. They released a healthy catalog of rockabilly, country, and pop sides in the late 1950s, eventually signing Merle Haggard in the early 1960s and launching his career. And Fuzzy was Haggard's manager for decades up until Merle passed away in 2016. Now, would Buck Owens or Merle Haggard's careers have happened no matter what? Probably. These were two very talented guys. But both their big breaks can directly be traced back to the success of A Dear John letter and Hillbilly Barton. So what became of Hillbilly Barton? Not long after this whole episode, he moved to Oregon, then Olympia, Washington, where he opened a nightclub. He eventually left after shooting a man during some kind of scuffle, went to Boise, Cincinnati, Kentucky, Grand Junction, Colorado, Albuquerque, and ultimately Nashville. He recorded under the names Johnny Grimes, Hillbilly Barton, Billy Boy Barton, Billy Barnoski, Laurel London, maybe some others that I don't even realize is Billy Barton. And there were rumors that he was responsible for an arson and all manner of other shenanigans, but he did find flashes of success along the way. He wrote a couple of top 10 hits, but ultimately faded into country music obscurity. Hillbilly Barton is forgotten, but the Bakersfield Sound lives on. And in the final analysis, if we define the Bakersfield Sound as a time and place that is commercially significant in country music history, then there's no doubt that Billy Barton inadvertently helped launch a movement. But he is just one of many characters that made contributions toward earning this city the one-time nickname of country music capital of the West. And thus ends my story.
Is one of my favorites. That Hillbilly Barton story is one of my favorites. I tell about a 1 minute long version of it, and you worked it into an entire lecture.
I will say that I have never once been accused of brevity.
Well, don't start now. Let me ask you about influences. Buck Owens told me that one of his greatest influences was Little Richard, which was kind of surprising.
Yeah.
Had you heard that? And who are some of the other rock and roll or popular influences that might have affected these guys?
I think one of the most illuminating interviews that I ever had regarding the Bakersfield Sound was with Don Markham. And Don, of course, played in Merle's band for many years. He was playing in the Blackboard with Bill Woods and Buck back in the 50s. He went into great detail about how he and Buck would go to the record shop and listen to R&B records, Elvis records, Western swing records, rumbas, whatever. And I've seen in interviews Buck talk about his greatest influences were Bob Wills and Little Richard. And what that is about, as best I can tell, is that Rosalie Mayfist told me, she said when she and Joe first came and played at the Blackboard, and they wrote Dim Lights, Thick Smoke, and Loud, Loud Music about that experience, that they were shocked that everyone was dancing. Because back east, where they came from, playing on these radio barn dances and stuff, people weren't dancing. They were sitting and politely listening to music. And they were shocked that the point in Bakersfield, the point on the West Coast was to dance. That's what the music was there for. People weren't coming to sit in chairs and listen to it. They were coming to dance. So the job of any band in any club where dancing is the point is to keep people dancing. So it didn't matter if it was Little Richard or if it was George Jones or if it was Elvis Presley. Got to keep them dancing. So play a rumba, play a tango, play anything as long as it keeps people dancing. So I think that, what people think of as the Bakersfield Sound is kind of the Wynn Stewart sound, which became the Buck Owens sound. To me, it's the Ralph Mooney sound because he played on a lot of early Merle records too. Ralph Mooney's steel guitar to me is kind of what I think most people think they mean when they say the Bakersfield Sound. And yes, we certainly call that the Bakersfield Sound. But I think if you walked into a club, and there's people here who can confirm or deny this, but I think if you walked into a club in Bakersfield in the 1950s, you're going to hear a lot of sounds.
Who you introduced us to Hillbilly Barton, and of course many of us know about Bill Woods. But who would you say is the one artist who did not get his due, who had the sort of talent that could have been a national stardom, but he just didn't make it, or she didn't make it?
I think that the artists, there's several. This box set has 10 CDs, almost 300 tracks on it.
7 pounds.
7 pounds.
It weighs 7 pounds.
Yeah. And there are some tracks on here that are honestly kind of clunkers, but they're there because it's important to show the whole thing. But I'm surprised by how many tracks there are by people that most folks outside of the city limits here have never heard of, who were phenomenally talented. And one of those people that sticks out in my mind is Johnny Barnett. And I think we kind of, when we talk about music history, we measure people by records, because that's how, if we weren't around at the time, that's how we experienced their music. Johnny Barnett only ever made one record. It was for Tally. One side was called Second Fiddle, written by Merle Haggard and Jelly Sanders. That was the first song written by Merle Haggard that was ever commercially released. So it's an interesting snapshot because you're hearing Merle's first commercial song. You get to hear Johnny Barnett, which if you weren't around in that time, the only way you're going to get to hear him is through this record. And then the flip side was, I think, Maybe Too Old to Hurt, a Red Simpson song. I believe that was the flip side of that record. But these are the only two records that we have of Johnny Barnett. So if you weren't around going to the Lucky Spot in that time, that's all you're going to know of him. And for me, not having been of that era, when I hear Johnny Barnett sing on those records, I think, man, this guy could have been, he could have been a star, certainly a regional star. And he was at the Lucky Spot for many years. Holding it down, and was very popular locally. But he's a guy that I wish, I think, what if he'd made some more records?
This is actually your second monster CD set. You also did one on one of my favorite guys, and you mentioned him. Tell us a little bit about the whole truck driving song phenomenon. How did that get started, and how did our favorite guy, Red Simpson, play into that?
Well, there is lore that Ken Nelson, who I mentioned at Capitol Records, who produced A Dear John Letter, wanted to make an album of truck driving songs. And it is said that he approached Merle Haggard and Merle wasn't interested. I asked Merle when I interviewed him if that's what really happened, and he had no memory of that whatsoever. He said, Ken Nelson never told me what to do or asked me to do certain things. He just gave me the freedom to do what I did. So really, and you know, maybe he asked him in passing and he forgot because it didn't seem like a significant moment. But whatever, Ken Nelson was looking for somebody to record truck driving songs because they were becoming popular with people like Dave Dudley, and Ken Nelson was no dummy. I mean, if something was successful on another label, he wanted Capitol to have their version of it. So when Elvis blew up, Ken Nelson signed Gene Vincent. You know, he was always wanting to make sure that Capitol was covered, you know, with their competitors. So what's interesting is that Red always said that his first Capitol session was the truck driving songs. And I found the session sheets showing that the first session he ever did at Capitol was not truck driving songs. They were songs that later appeared on his Bakersfield Dozen album. And I said, Red, I don't think that was your first, I don't think that your truck driving song. He was like, no, I know, I was there, you know, you weren't. And I'm like, okay, I don't think these musician union sheets are lying. But I think what happened is Red didn't know that he was cutting a session. I think they basically brought him in to kind of audition him and see if they might want to make him a Capitol artist, and then they later released those recordings. But the first things they put out were the truck driving things. And Red kind of became known as a truck driving guy, which in a way is great because it gave him a hook to give him wider exposure to a national audience, and in another way is kind of unfortunate because he was such a great songwriter and wrote over 30 songs that Buck recorded and about a half dozen that Merle recorded. Some of the great Bakersfield standards like You Don't Have Far to Go and Close Up the Honky Tonks. You know, it's kind of unfortunate in a way that he's thought of as kind of a novelty guy that just does truck driving songs, but man, he did the truck driving songs really great. So I have mixed feelings about that because it did give him a platform, but also I think most people don't realize the depth of what an incredible songwriter he was.
His New York Times obituary lists him as a truck driving song artist. And,
Yeah.
and of course, yeah, you're right. He had some great songs that had nothing to do with that. Talk about a two-pronged question here. Was there actually a rivalry between Nashville and Bakersfield? And talk also, what were the differences, the musical differences between those two?
So this is kind of a fraught issue, and I think you and I don't agree on this. So after this, we'll wrestle.
We'll wrestle for it.
Yeah,
Okay. All right.
and that'll be part 4 of tonight's festivities.
Right.
No. The short answer is I don't think that there was a rivalry, and here's why. Almost every article I've ever read about the Bakersfield Sound says that it was a quote-unquote reaction to the slick, polished sounds that were coming out of Nashville. I don't think that it was a reaction because that still makes Nashville the measuring stick, and it makes it sound like these guys weren't playing music and they heard what was coming out of Nashville and they didn't like it, so they learned how to play music to do something different than that. So in that regard, I don't think it's a reaction. I think people here were doing what they did, and like I said, it was dance music. Back there, it was sitting and listening music. So what became known as the Bakersfield Sound, because Buck really emphasized the drums and the beat and all that stuff, that came out of those clubs. So that wasn't reacting against Nashville. Now, I think what those guys did feel like was, I don't want to be put into a Nashville box. I don't want to change what I do to fit some formula. So in that regard, I think there was a bit of a chip on the shoulder about like, no, you're not going to mold me into something I'm not. And I was talking about this earlier today, but I think one of the reasons that the rivalry idea has come up is that artists who went to Nashville from the West Coast in the 50s and 60s, people like Tex Ritter or Johnny Bond, not Bakersfield people, but Los Angeles people, they went to Nashville at a time when they were still at the top of their game career-wise. And they were very much embraced by Nashville and became part of that community. I know of other musicians who kind of stuck it out on the West Coast deep into the 70s when things were starting to dry up. Then they went to Nashville. I think those are the people who are more apt to say there was a rivalry, because I think at that point, some of the musicians in Nashville felt like, well, sure, now you want to come here, because it's dried up out there. So why should we, welcome you with open arms? And I can understand that thinking when there's a small group of people competing for work. So I don't think that there was like this uniform rivalry, but I think that there were certain people in Nashville and in Bakersfield who had chips on their shoulders and they felt strongly, and Buck was one of them. I mean, Buck was determined to always point out, I'm Buck Owens from Bakersfield. And if he hadn't done that, people might not have talked about the Bakersfield Sound. So the fact that he was kind of rebellious and had that chip on his shoulder worked in the favor of the music community here. I think Buck was much more contentious towards Nashville than Merle was. Merle recorded a lot in Nashville. And Ken Nelson, I mean, all these guys are recording in Capitol Records with Ken Nelson. And people talk about, oh, the Bakersfield Sound is raw and rough and authentic and real. And Nashville is slick and polished and fake. Well, Ken Nelson produced Ferlin Husky's Gone in Nashville with more strings and backup vocals and syrup on it than you can possibly imagine. So you can't say, well, Ken Nelson was just interested in doing one kind of music. You listen to a guy like Billy Mize. Sounded like, I mean, he could have been a Sinatra type if he wanted. That guy was a crooner, you know, and he made some records that sounded like the Bakersfield Sound, but he made a lot of records that sounded pretty Nashville. You know, so there were people in Bakersfield making music that was softer and lusher, and there were people in Nashville who were making music that was rougher and edgier, you know, and I don't think it's just a more complex story than a rivalry. So that, kind of boiling it down to that is always kind of bugged me because I think it's more complicated than that. And I think it's almost a case-by-case basis. Buck Owens, yes.
To continue the argument, rather than artists making a conscious decision to step away from what Nashville was doing, I'm thinking that the audience made a conscious decision that this is what they liked as opposed to this, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that audiences now, I mean, country music is a big umbrella. Rock music is a big umbrella. R&B is a big umbrella, you know. So how is, you know, Ray Price singing Make the World Go Away country music, and so is Buck Owens singing Love's Gonna Live Here? But they are, you know, it's a wide umbrella. So, but I think within that, people kind of get into their factions and they talk about, well, this is real country music, or this is more authentic, so therefore it's better. When really, like, let's be real, it just comes down to what people enjoy, what their tastes are. And I gotta say, a lot of the country music that's popular now, I have no interest in. It just doesn't appeal to me. But I'm not mad at the people that it does appeal to, you know, fine, have your thing. You know, at the time that Buck Owens was coming out, people were saying they considered that newfangled and non-traditional, you know, and I love what Buck did. So it's just a matter of perspective, and history changes the way we view those things and how significant they were or weren't. I feel like a lot of the music now is more disposable. It's hard for me to imagine that we'll be talking about some of the current hits 40, 50 years later. But who knows? You know, history will be the judge.
Well, you and I won't be talking about it 40 or 50 years.
No. We will have killed each other in our wrestling match later tonight.
That's right. Buck Owens had a real hold on the Bakersfield Sound. I mean, he was Bakersfield's country music guy. He promoted, as you said, Bakersfield quite a bit. Talk about how that helped Bakersfield and also how it may have hindered Bakersfield.
That is a good question, and one that I've thought a lot about. Oh, I see. I think that Buck really put Bakersfield on the map nationally. I mean, Wynn Stewart had a very similar sound to Buck before he did, but Wynn lacked something that Buck had, which was work ethic. If Buck had not become a country music star, he would have still been rich. He would have found some other way to get rich. That guy was a businessman. He was driven. He was going to do whatever he needed to do, regardless of how he had to do it to become a success. So, because of that, people, and because he had a chip on his shoulder about being from Bakersfield, people came to associate that sound with Bakersfield, and I think that Buck is largely responsible for putting Bakersfield on the map for a national audience, or for people consciously realizing, oh, this guy is from Bakersfield, because it's sort of, you can think of most country stars and think, where's that person from? And it doesn't automatically pop into your head necessarily. Garth Brooks, yeah, he's from Oklahoma, but I had to think about that for a minute. He doesn't strike me as the embodiment of an Oklahoma sound. But Buck, it's Bakersfield, it's right there. Now, I think Buck gave birth to people knowing that there's something called the Bakersfield Sound. I think he also, in the end, hurt what was happening in this town because I think he was such a businessman and he was so geared in that direction that there wasn't a lot of room for other people to do their thing. And I think that Buck liked the idea of this town being a country music center, but he didn't like the idea of other people kind of having a piece of that pie. And so that edges other people out, and eventually it chokes out what could have flourished into a real, second Nashville, a satellite Nashville. And but it didn't happen. And so I give Buck a lot of credit, positively and negatively, for the way that, without him we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this. But had he sort of held it differently, once it did happen, we might be sitting in a very different town that is a music industry center and not just a live music center.
What happened to the Bakersfield Sound? What was the demise of the Bakersfield Sound?
I've heard a lot of theories on that. People say the drunk driving laws got stricter and people were more afraid to go out. I've heard people say, well, television came along and people didn't want to go out. They wanted to stay home. That one's a little harder for me to believe because Austin kind of rose as a live music capital in that same time. I think that when Don Rich died, it really took the heart out of Buck. It took the soul out of Buck. And he was a driving force, love him or hate him, He was a really driving force behind country music in this town. 1974 was the last year that Merle Haggard lived in Bakersfield. So Merle moved away. Don Rich died. Even though there was a Bakersfield music community before there was a Buck Owens and a Merle Haggard, those guys became the sort of rallying points for the commercial awareness of Bakersfield. And you're talking about guys who essentially were gone at that point. Merle physically, Buck spiritually and emotionally. And I think that has as much to do with it as anything. I don't think you can point to any one factor and say, well, if this had just been different. But, I think those were very important influences.
Not a random thing to have selected 1974 as the sort of the bookend.
Yeah, that's why I decided to cut the box set off there. It could have gone much further. Well, Bear Family Records wasn't going to let me take it further. I already had...
They didn't want to do 30 CDs?
Yeah, I already had... My initial list was 3 times as long as what wound up on here. And there was... Originally, it was going to be 6, and I begged them to 8, and I begged them to 10, and then that was a hard 10. And so I said, well, one way we can help widen this down is to just pick a cutoff point. And I arbitrarily picked... Well, it wasn't arbitrary. I picked that date for that reason, because it was the last year that Merle lived here, and it was the year that Don Rich died.
A question I get all the time, and I always disappoint with the answer. Will the Bakersfield Sound ever make a comeback? Can it make a comeback? Can we get it back?
I don't think that you can ever recapture something that was that special. There was a magic to it, and it happened among a group of people who had this shared cultural experience. All of these folks' parents, or they themselves, came out from Arkansas and Oklahoma and Texas and Missouri, and that whole Dust Bowl thing. Almost everyone I ever interviewed about this talked about, yeah, my family was like the Grapes of Wrath. They always talked about the Grapes of Wrath. It was very much, that was our family's story. So you have these people who come out here. They're not accepted by the polite society in town, so they band together. And they've got their kind of music and their kind of cooking and their kind of church and all the stuff that they had back home, and they've got it here. And what we call the Bakersfield Sound emerged out of that community in a very natural way by a bunch of people that were all young and hungry, and none of them, had anything to speak of, and they did it by working together the same way that farmers work together to accomplish tasks. That's the life that they knew. And I think that in our world of social media and, PR managers and all the machinery that goes with the music industry today. I just don't think something could happen again like that that's just that natural and just flowers out of that moment and that kind of community, because people would be too different from each other and too ego-driven and, whatever. I don't unfortunately think that something like that comes back and happens a second time. That's why it's magic.
As you said, and I agree, it was a time and a place.
Yeah.
So you've been working on this more or less for, 15 years in a sense, I think, and certainly the last 10 and in a concentrated way just in the last several years. How do you follow up on 7 pounds of twang? What's next?
What's next? Man, it just came out. Let me rest a minute.
Get busy. Come on.
No, I am writing a book about the Bakersfield Sound. It's funny because I started writing a book about the Bakersfield Sound, and I've written 5 books since that have nothing to do with the Bakersfield Sound. And the reason I was able to do that is because I wasn't as close to those other subjects. Not to say I didn't care, I certainly cared, but this is my passion. This is the thing that I'm most interested in. And I was, talking earlier today about, I don't call myself a historian, I call myself a student of music history, because there's always a lot more to learn. And every time I learn something, I learn how much I don't know. And I think that's why it's taken me so long to write this book, because I turn over a stone and, hey, there's 5 more stones. And it's very hard for me, because I'm personally invested in it, to just let it go and say, okay, well, good enough. So I'm a little bit paralyzed by it in a way. So when it comes to Bakersfield, that's my ultimate goal, is to write, this huge, maybe 2-volume book about Bakersfield, and to find a new spin on it, so our books can be companion pieces.
That's a great idea. I like that. I like that idea. How are we doing? Okay.
Yeah, I think we could do questions now if you guys want.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'll bring the mic up.
And by the way, Scott, are these available for sale today?
Yes, they are available for sale back there at the table, and let's just go ahead and get the sticker shock out of the way. They're $195, which is not cheap, but there's 10 CDs in there, so it's about $15 per disc, and a hardback book. It's about $45 worth of hardback book. So then you put it all together and you go, whoa! But
$27 a pound.
$27 a pound. But I do think that it's absolutely worth it. I do think that it's, it's, for one, it was really expensive for Bear Family Records to produce them. But I think it's worth it for the history that's there, because nobody's tried to do anything like this before. And I will say, one of my guiding principles when I said, if anybody's going to go buy a box set that's got 300 tracks of Bakersfield music, they probably are not looking for Tiger by the Tail to be in there. They've got that already. So we tried to put something together where there's a lot of Buck and Merle, but there's a lot of other people too. And even the Buck and Merle stuff is deep cuts or alternate versions or live versions of some of the better known songs, because I wanted this to be something that has value for people who really go deep on this stuff, and not, all the things that everybody's already bought 5 times already in various versions. So this is to me, it is a museum piece. It's a historically significant collection, but it's also really a lot of fun to listen to.
Special tonight, I brought some copies of my book. I'll throw it in free. Anybody that buys one of your books, one of your things,
Wow.
I'll throw it in there.
Hey,
So,
there you go.
Special bonus.
Nice. You can get all your Christmas shopping done right here tonight.
Absolutely. This is yeah.
I get a free book.
Absolutely.
Just so honored that you're here. Thank you for sharing those stories. That Hillbilly story was fantastic at the beginning, so thank you for sharing that. My question for both of you really is kind of a bookend to Bob Price's first question to you about the influences of some of these musicians. I would like your take on people that you hear today or that you've heard in the last 5-10 years and you think, ooh, they sound like the Bakersfield Sound. So who could you introduce us to or our students to that have some sort of ripple effect that you really think comes from this period so that we can turn ourselves on to some new music?
You know, I did a interview for NPR the other day, and the woman asked me that question: where is the Bakersfield Sound alive and well today? And I wasn't expecting that question, and I went, And, you know, I started thinking about what names come to mind. Well, Dwight Yoakam, the Derailers, Marty Stewart, Jim Lauderdale, Rosie Flores. And then I go, you know, all those artists came out 20, 30 years ago, you know, originally. And while I think of Dwight as being more contemporary because he's a lot younger than, you know, Buck and Merle, now Dwight's kind of a legacy artist too, you know.
60 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's funny to think he's 60 because the jeans, he doesn't look 60.
He does
when he
not,
takes
no.
the hat off, it's different.
Then he looks 60.
Yeah. But then after I left the interview, I thought, oh, man, the person I should have said is Chris Shiflett. Chris Shiflett is the lead guitarist in Foo Fighters.
He's also got the Dead Peasants.
Yeah, he's got a band called Chris Shiflett and the Dead Peasants, and he's got a new album out just under the name Chris Shiflett. And he wrote the foreword for the book, for the box set. And I thought I should have mentioned Chris because Chris is a rock guy who comes from the punk world and then in Foo Fighters, who has really embraced the Bakersfield Sound. And he's got a podcast called Walking the Floor, and he interviewed Red Simpson before Red passed. He interviewed Merle. He interviewed Tommy Hayes, was one of the first ones he did. He's really legit interested in the Bakersfield Sound. So I think where I see the greatest rays of hope are not necessarily in new country artists that are coming out and duplicating the Bakersfield Sound, but in rock artists who are discovering the historical significance of the Bakersfield Sound and telling the rock audience about it. You know, me being here tonight is preaching to the choir, but a guy going to a rock audience and saying, no, check this stuff out. There's something here I think you'll like. So to me, Chris Shiflett is an important guiding light.
I can't really add to that except to say I know that Brad Paisley has sort of honored the Bakersfield Sound in his words, if not in his music, but in his music as well.
Yeah, and he's old too now.
He's old too now, yeah.
Why do we keep all getting old?
I don't know. It just keeps happening.
Anybody else have a question?
I'd like to make a statement, if I may. Yeah, my name is Jack Hudspeth, and I truly, my whole life has been country music, and go back and just talking to these beautiful ladies here next to me and meeting this gentleman here for the first time. I go back, and there's two things I want to mention to you that I've never heard mentioned about Buck and his talent, and Lord only knows. Yeah, he's a talented musician. You're not going to knock that. I mean, a dollar sign will keep you from acknowledging anything other than that. But you go back, and Bill Woods told him, this is before he was ever really the Buck Owens that we know him. He said, you got to sing higher. You got to get a higher pitch on your voice. So let's give Bill, we all acknowledge Bill has helped so many people and done so much. But Bill actually hammered that into him. Let's get you in singing in a higher pitch. Because if you know anything about music and a lot of that harmony, and when you heard Don come in, and I was listening just before I come over here today, and Don Rich sang in harmony with somebody else, and they really mixed. Well, he mixed with Buck in that high pitch, and so I think that's worth noting that somebody would come along in his early days before he made it, and it isn't. If he didn't make a nickel in the music business, yes, I agree with all of you. Buck was an astute businessman. The difference between him and Merle, I know both those backgrounds, and I know there was a lot of difference for Merle than it was Buck. And if you went back to somebody that you don't ever hear too many people mention about, a gentleman by the name of Chester Smith up in the northern part of the world.
Out of Modesto.
Yeah, he buy Buck Owens with pocket change. He reach into pocket change and buy Buck Owens. When he died, he was worth $2 billion. So them old country boys, they have done good. But Chester, he seen the need for the Hispanic radio and TV, jumped on it, used his brains and everything, and so it really good. One other thing I want to mention is the fact that I seen an interview where Charlie Daniels was paying tribute to Merle, which he loved Merle, and he said there was no greater. But he said, and I'm going to agree with you and probably get a little disagreements out of my friend from the Californian there. Charlie Daniels said no such thing as a Bakersfield Sound. Said, hell, if he was playing the Mojave, it'd been the Mojave Sound. Well, you understand that when you research these guys and you know about them. He sent all the way to Texas to get Waylon Jennings, steel player, to come out here and play on some of his cuts because he was the one. They had that sound, and Waylon had that steel man with him for 20 years. And so they created the music that they wanted to hear, and the public liked it. But Charlie Daniels said, there ain't no such thing as the Bakersfield Sound. So I don't want to bust your bubble or anything, but that's just an opinion. But it's nice to know that his opinion of that and why he felt like that. Like I was telling this young lady here, I remember Roy Nichols played at a little beer joint across from Mooney's Grove there in Tulare, up there on Mooney Boulevard. It was called the Park Inn. Hell, Roy Nichols is not from Bakersfield. And Merle Haggard, if you ever listen to his interviews, he tells why Roy played a different style of guitar and what he did to get that sound. They all played Fender guitars, so we're going to call it the Fender sound or the Bakersfield sound. I don't know.
To that point, and one of the things that we wanted to do with this box set was to show that the Bakersfield Sound, and I tried, I know that people are going to have certain expectations of what that term, the Bakersfield Sound, means. So there's some things on the box set that I had to include, like Barbara Mandrell's first record, which sounds nothing like the Bakersfield Sound, but you got to have it because it's important to note that Barbara Mandrell's first solo record was on a Bakersfield label, But when you look at what contributed to making the Bakersfield Sound, Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys in 1946 played in Bakersfield once every week. And they didn't live here, but they were touring up and down the coast. They were playing here every week. So their influence on what we call the Bakersfield Sound, they didn't live here, but their influence and the Maddox Brothers and Rose didn't live here, but they played here so much that that's what these guys were soaking up when they were young. So no music exists in a vacuum. All music, draws from other influences. And Roy Nichols, both Buck Owens and Merle Haggard considered Roy Nichols their hero because Merle would say, here's this 15-year-old guy and he doesn't got to go to school. He gets to tour the Maddox Brothers and Rose and play. And Buck and Merle both wanted to be guitar players. That was what they wanted to do at first, was to be, they both wanted to be Roy Nichols. And then they started singing. And once they did, Buck did everything to ensure that he became a star. If he visited a DJ, he would write that guy a letter. He would jot down what that DJ's wife and kids' names were. He worked a formula to make sure that he became a star and a wealthy man. Merle did everything wrong and sabotaged himself at every point, but was so remarkably naturally talented that he couldn't help but become a star. And I think you could write an entire book about these two men and their personalities and how different they were, and yet they both became the two biggest stars to come out of Bakersfield. So good observations.
Just want to say thanks for both of you for being here tonight. It's amazing to have you here. I've wore out a copy of your book already. Quick question. I grew up mid-'70s playing in the Fresno Visalia area, and back then everybody in country, local musicians, we were all working like 6 nights a week, 7 nights a week. Everybody wanted to hire a band. Every club had music. And that area up there, it's just like it is here now, unfortunately. That seems to all be gone. Do you think not just the Bakersfield Sound, but just live country music in general is going to make a comeback?
I don't know. I don't know that I have the expertise to speak to that. I know that it's a lot harder now than ever before for people to make money at recordings. Nobody buys music anymore. Everything's on the internet. So you can't make a living making records. You could make a living in the 60s and 70s making records and never tour if you had the right connections. That doesn't exist anymore. So even the biggest stars in the world are going to be touring a lot more than they maybe would have 10, 15, 20 years ago. So if anybody has got it in their mind that they want to make a living at music, that's kind of their only option now, is to play live. So that might be a sign that there will be more live music. But ultimately, I don't know. That's just speculation.
I know that the Convention and Visitors Bureau get questions all the time. Visitors coming from out of town. Where can I go to hear the Bakersfield Sound? Where can I go to hear live music? And they get a lot of shrugs. But I think there's something that can be done about that. I think the Visitors Bureau is looking into different ways they might start promoting live music here. It's not going to be the Bakersfield Sound per se. It may not even be country music, but I think there's a way to get people in the clubs and kind of enjoy the music that comes out of Bakersfield.
First, Scott, I'd like to commend you on the wonderful, excellent job you've done on your research and your interviews. It's the very best that I've heard, and
Thank you.
I keep telling Bob, I was here. We came to California from Oklahoma in 1941 to the Sunset Labor Camp, and my dad fortunately got a job right away. And then I had heard a sound that I didn't even remember. We didn't have a radio. There was no music in our home. But I heard music somewhere, sometime, that was, I know they had 2 fiddles, kind of, that I heard again when Bob Wills was here, which was, unfortunately, Spade Cooley.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think the earliest good music, we just called it good music. But the thing that was missing that younger folks don't know, and people growing up today, yeah, we have some talented people around here still. We have some music, and if this community could support it financially, we'd have music someplace every night. That's the difference in Bakersfield and Nashville. Early on, someone saw back there, these were poor people, the the Carters, the early music. They were uneducated people that sang for their own entertainment in their homes. And shortly after that, when folks came from the east out here, Dust Bowl times, it was the same thing. They were not accepted locally, so they stayed home and played music to entertain themselves.
Right.
And also, anytime, any place, there are people who are subject to be extremely, extremely talented. That was Roy Nicholson. Yeah, he got out of school real young, 15 years old. But the thing that you don't know, that I know, is that I was here, and poor people are hungry. They're not lazy. They're hungry to work. They're hungry to make a living. And Buck Owens was way more hungry than Merle Haggard was. I knew them both. I was there. That was the difference. And Buck learned early on how to make a dime and turn it into 2 dimes and live his whole life. And he probably still has a nickel out of that first dime. I mean, that's who he was.
Right.
But to his credit, by the time he lived his life and died, he was a wonderful human being. After Roy had a stroke, he was extremely good to him. And that's another thing that we don't see typically, is folks caring about other folks. I met Roy when I was 14, met Bill Woods probably I was 12 or 13, just because he lived on the way home from school.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing in that man then, it wasn't just about big I, little you. He appreciated folks with talent. Herb Henson did. He always, you know, he would feature somebody on his show because he wanted other folks to do good. But the reason that can't come around again, Bob, is because I don't know that, I hope we don't live to see the day where folks are as near starving to death as they were in the 40s. And if people would pay to enjoy music today, I think we'd have music someplace every night.
Yeah.
But those days, people came and worked for free because they wanted to work. They wanted
Yeah.
to play music, and people wanted to dance. Thank you so much, Scott. You did a wonderful job, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Larry.
And I love you, whatever kind of job you do.
First of all, I just want to say thank you to both of you men sitting up there on that couch, because you are bringing light to a group of men and women who have dedicated their lives to our town. So thank you very much. Now, I did want to say to you, Scott, I was excited when I saw that the years were 1940 to 74, because so often people referring to what is the Bakersfield Sound, oh, it's the 50s, 60s, maybe into the 70s. But there were men and women here in Bakersfield that I had never heard of until my sister, Linda Rankin, and I formed Citizens Preserving History for Merle Haggard's boxcar home after Del Houston, who used to travel with Merle, told us about it. We spent 8 years, and as we were working on a fundraiser, there were a bunch of the Bakersfield Sound musicians there at a dinner dance, and we totally lost our heads when we said, if we ever get the boxcar to the museum, then we're going to do something to honor you. And many of you know we are working on a video documentary of the Bakersfield Sound, the musicians, and it's more to just say a big thank you to these men and women. And as I was about to say about the 1940s, there were men and women that were playing that I had never heard of, and names like Bud Hobbs, Tex Butler, Anna Reading's dad, Lloyd Reading. Just, it is so interesting to see the foundation that was laid by these people that brought what people today think this is the Bakersfield Sound. Well, history doesn't stop and start at one point. It emerged. And so maybe there were a couple of different Bakersfield Sounds along the way, and that it emerged into what Buck and Merle took around the world. But I think all of us here in Bakersfield need to stand up and say, I'm proud to be an Okie, whether you came from Oklahoma or not.
Yeah, we when we put it together, the first recordings on the box set are field recordings from 1940, and Laurie mentioned the camps. Well, these guys from, I think, Yale or Harvard. Anyway, these two guys, Todd and Sunken, were their last names.
New York
came out.
City College.
New York City College. I knew they were some kind of Yankee. They came out and made these field recordings with people mostly playing like acoustic guitar. Some of them are just singing a cappella. And that sounds nothing like what became the Bakersfield Sound. There was no such thing as the Bakersfield Sound yet. But that's why we started there, because those are those roots. That's the four people who have one way to entertain themselves, and that drive and that hunger, like you were talking about. So that's where it begins. And those recordings to me are very interesting because they're so raw. These weren't people who were going into a recording studio. They were just capturing a moment. And you really get a glimpse into what kind of music you might have heard in 1940 if you were walking through one of those camps?
My wife and I, Diane and I, just recently traveled to Muskogee, Oklahoma, for the 50th anniversary of Merle Haggard's song. And a phenomenon that we discovered there is something very similar that's going on here, is that the excitement of that song, or the excitement of the Bakersfield Sound, is not present in that city. It's present all around it, all around the country, Canada, Europe, so on and so forth. Within Bakersfield, I was just talking to a gentleman today. It wasn't until he worked in San Francisco that he learned about the Bakersfield Sound. And the people in Muskogee have the same sort of problem with an image, but people, for this concert, there was about 300 people from Muskogee and about 1,000 people from out of town that came to see this concert. And I just think that was kind of interesting that that sort of thing was going on.
Yeah. Somebody mentioned earlier about, Nashville really capitalized on their country music industry and that there's a whole tourist industry built around it. And, Nashville in the early days, the Grand Ole Opry was so important to the development of Nashville because so much stuff grew up around that. The industry grew up around that. But when the Grand Ole Opry first started becoming popular, the city fathers and mothers in Nashville did not embrace that. Nashville was called the Athens of the South. They have a huge full-scale replica of the Parthenon for some reason in Nashville. Vanderbilt University, the Harvard of the South. They wanted to be a city known for arts and culture. They did not want to be associated with Minnie Pearl and Roy Acuff and the Grand Ole Opry. That was, to them, to the polite society in Nashville, that was hayseed stuff. That was setting them back. That was reinforcing stereotypes that they didn't want to be associated with. At some point, people in Nashville realized how much money could be made in country music, or they saw how much money was being made in country music, and the city embraced it. And a tourist industry grew up around it. Then comes Garth Brooks, who shows what phenomenal amounts of money can be made, and it blows up even more. So if you go to Nashville today, Nashville has an identity. It has a lower broad with bars, with music coming out of them, and some of it is Merle Haggard, and some of it is Leonard Skinner, and some of it is almost heavy metal, and you're like, well, how does this all make sense? But it does, and all these tourists come there, and it's a huge thing because the city invested in it. And I don't think that Bakersfield, I don't think the city ever moved beyond that initial stage of, gosh, we don't want people thinking we're a bunch of hayseeds. We don't want people thinking that, these negative stereotypes of country music. And I think that is really unfortunate because if, people all the time come here and say, where can I hear the Bakersfield Sound? Where's the blackboard? Where's the lucky spot? I can show you where it used to be. So even if someone comes here as a fan, like I did for the first time in 2001, ready to go experience Bakersfield, well, I went to the Crystal Palace. I went to Trout's, and of course that's gone now. And then that was it. Like, what else? So there was, on the part of the city, and there have been a lot of people like Di and others before her who have launched these citizen-driven efforts to preserve things. But as far as I know, and I don't live here, but as far as I know, the city never really moved into that mindset of let's really celebrate and preserve and build a tourist industry around this. And it's really unfortunate because I think that's one of the main things that people would come here for.
I think just very lately, the city has kind of got on board. With this new branding campaign, the city's slogan is the sound of something better, which of course is words right out of the streets of Bakersfield. So they're a little late to the party, and I'm not sure everybody gets that reference. In fact, I know they don't, but they're trying. Gotta believe. Gotta believe.
All right, well, I think, is there any more questions? Or I wanted to remind you guys that we do have a mailing list for our events, and it's back on the table back there, so if you want to sign up, you could hear about other things that are coming to the library. We don't always get Bakersfield Sound stuff, but I'm sure there's some things you'll be interested in. So please sign up for that, and we'll add you to our list, and you'll hear about what's going on.
And we do have the box sets as well back there at the back table. So even if you're not ready to get one tonight, at least go check it out, thumb through it, check out some of those photos, and flip onto the page where Sonny Anglin is, because he's in the audience right here, and he's also in that book. So.
And Scott, you'll be at the Crystal Palace tomorrow night.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. Tomorrow night, we're doing a party at the Crystal Palace. We're going to officially launch this thing with a concert. Tonight is about learning about it. Tomorrow night's about experiencing it. Tommy Hayes' band will be the house band, but we'll have Bobby Durham performing. Susan Ray is going to come perform. Norm Hamlet and Mario Carboni will be playing together. So quite a few people who are actually on this box set. But then we'll also have people like Deke Dickerson coming up from LA. Kaylee Chapman, who's a Bakersfield native but lives in LA now, is coming up. So we'll have Kim Maccabee. Everybody's coming. All the great performers in town. So we're gonna have the folks who were on this box set who made these records, and then the folks who came after and are paying tribute. So it's gonna be a great time. 5 p.m. doors, 6:30 music. They're kicking us out at 9, so don't come too late.
Thank you very much, guys. Yeah.